What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking another look at the Motorola Moto G Pure and going over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy in 2023. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out the description where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now, the Moto G Pure is definitely an older phone now, having been released around December of 2021, but for what it is, I do think it does have a decent amount to offer. For the display, we're getting a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 270, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So on one hand, not the best display, but again, keep in mind, this is a really low-end device that you can typically get for under $100 at this point, if not for free from a carrier deal. So considering this, on one hand, some people do consume a lot of content. If you're watching lots of videos and you want a really nice looking image, then yeah, in that case, you're probably going to want a slightly larger 1080p display, maybe something like an AMOLED instead of an IPS LCD, and you might want a higher refresh rate too. But of course, not everyone is going to be using their phone like that. Maybe you don't really consume a lot of content and you really just need something for more basic activities. In that case, I do think the display we're getting here will at least get the job done. And I mean, at 6.5 inches, while not being the largest display you can get, the Moto G Pure definitely is decently large, so if you're doing stuff like web browsing, social media, or even watching the occasional video every now and then, for what it is, I do think this display is at least good enough. Now for storage, with the Moto G Pure, we're getting 32GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and now, despite at least having microSD card expansion, I feel like at this point in 2023, 32GB is honestly pretty low, and granted, when it comes to phones in this price range, unfortunately there's still plenty of phones like this that have just as little storage, which again, I feel like at this point in 2023 is really not going to be enough for most people. But again, keep in mind, this is really one of the most basic devices you can get, so if you really are someone who's really not using your phone that much, and you're just looking for something for more basic activities anyway, then in that case, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone, and you make sure to offload everything you can onto a microSD card, you should at least get by. But again, if you're planning on doing really anything on this phone, if you are going to be downloading a decent amount of apps and stuff like that, I do recommend getting something that has at least 64GB, because again, in my opinion, at this point in 2023, 32 is really not enough anymore. Now for security features, this phone does have Face Unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here on the back, so definitely nice to get both options here, because while it's definitely not uncommon per se, when it comes to phones in this price range, a lot of the time they only have one or the other, so we do have some flexibility here. But real quick, let's give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, real fast and responsive, no issues at all. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, up front with the Moto G Pure, we got a 5-megapixel selfie camera. Then on the back, we got a dual camera with a 13-megapixel main camera and a 2-megapixel depth sensing camera. So unfortunately, when it comes to features, there's really not a whole lot here. Basically just regular photos in portrait mode. But first of all, considering again, this is a really entry-level device, I'm not really that surprised. Some phones like this have a decent amount of features, but even when they do have ultra-wide cameras and macro cameras, at this level, they're really not very good anyway. So in general, you're really not missing out on a whole lot here. But aside from the features, I do think the photo quality for what it is actually pretty decent. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like amazing or anything, and if you're maybe taking lots of Instagram pictures, for example, or really doing anything where the photo quality is a bit more important, then in that case, you probably will want something with a better camera. But for the more light, occasional use, I do think this phone's camera will at least get the job done. Now to give you an idea of what this camera can do, here's a couple pictures taken with the Moto G Pure. While it's not the most amazing photo quality ever, as you can see, this phone still can get some decent photos. So if you're really not going to be using your camera a ton, but you still at least want the ability to get a decently presentable photo every now and then in that case, I do think the Moto G Pure will at least be good enough. But again, if you're really going to be taking lots of pictures and just using your camera a lot, then in that case, you can probably justify getting something a bit higher end that has a better camera setup. Now for the RAM and processor, with the Moto G Pure, we're getting 3GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G25 processor. So overall for the performance, it's definitely not the fastest phone out there. In fact, I would say this phone, even for what it is pretty slow. So if you're going to be on your phone a bit more, doing more demanding activities, when it comes to stuff like that, I probably wouldn't even try it. But even if you're doing stuff like web browsing and social media, and you're just going to be on your phone a lot, you are going to notice this phone again is pretty slow. So just be aware you might not get the best experience. But again, for more light occasional use, if you're really just checking your email and social media every now and then, maybe doing a few quick Google searches or something like that. For that kind of use, it will get the job done, but again, if you're really going to be on your phone a lot, you are going to want to get something a bit faster. Now, I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 5. I don't think Geekbench 6 even works on this phone, but here are the scores I got. Now, what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance-wise compared to your current device, because depending on what you're coming from, I feel like this phone is probably either going to be a huge downgrade or maybe more of a lateral move. Either way, I seriously doubt anyone's going to see this phone as an upgrade. So I feel like in general, if you're considering this phone, you're probably not that concerned about performance and you really just need something for more basic activities anyway. But all the same, again, I can't stress this enough. This is definitely not a very fast phone, so don't expect too much from it. Now for the battery, the Moto G Pure has a 4000 mAh battery that supports 10 watt fast charging, so on one hand, not the best battery out there, but at the same time, it's not terrible, and in my experience, the battery life on this phone is pretty decent. That being said though, I do want to point out that at this point in 2023, most phones being released nowadays, even the super low-end ones like this, do tend to have 5000 mAh batteries instead, and while flagship phones, for example, typically have smaller batteries for whatever reason, when it comes to more of a budget device, if the battery life is more important to you, even in this price range, you can easily get a phone that has a better battery, so definitely keep this in mind. But also keep in mind if you're really just looking for a phone to use lightly throughout the day, despite not having the most amazing battery life, the battery on this phone will at least get the job done. Now for the software, it's kind of weird here because on one hand, I have heard of people with the Moto G Pure actually getting Android 12, and considering most Motorola phones nowadays, at least the ones that started out with Android 11, have been getting at least one major update. This does make sense, but for some reason this phone in my hand does have Android 11. But I feel like either way, if you cared that much about the software, you can easily get a phone that has Android 13 at this point. So in general, if the software and software support is important to you, then you're probably going to want to skip this phone. But at the same time, the common theme here is that of course, this is a really low-end basic device, and for more basic activities, if you really just want to make calls and send texts and stuff like that, you really don't need the latest version of Android. So if you are looking for something that's really stripped down and basic and your needs are really just not that complex, then most likely the software won't really make that much of a difference. And in general, despite technically only having Android 11, things on this phone do run decently well. So overall, having a more outdated software is really not that much of a hindrance. As far as other features go, unfortunately the Moto G Pure does not have NFC, which I can't really say I'm surprised. Motorola really only has NFC in a few of their phones anyway, but keep in mind they are actually pretty far behind when it comes to this, because at this point in 2023, even when it comes to lower end devices like this, I want to say most phones have NFC. Now, in this super bottom tier price range, it is a bit of a different story, but I've seen $100 Cricket phones that have NFC, which is along the lines of what this phone is really supposed to be. So in general, if you are looking for something to use tap and pay with, you can pretty easily find one, but at the same time, I know not everyone likes to use tap and pay anyway, so of course if you don't use tap and pay, then this phone not having NFC really won't matter too much. But in conclusion, is the Moto G Pure actually worth buying in 2023? Now usually when it comes to a phone like this that has these kinds of specs, I would typically say no, but honestly if you're looking for the absolute basics, if you really just need something to make calls, send text messages, do some occasional web searches, or maybe check your email or social media every now and then, and even watch the occasional YouTube video or something, even though this phone does technically have a successor, the Motorola Moto G Play 2023, I feel like there's really not that much of a difference between this phone and a phone like it that was made in 2023. Really, at best, the newer phones are going to have a bit more storage and maybe a newer version of Android, but aside from that, the difference at this level is really not that much. And again, keep in mind, lots of carriers that have this phone offer it for, if not free, really close to it. So on one hand, if you're expecting a really nice display, a ton of storage, a super nice camera setup, great performance, and a super large battery, then of course, you're definitely not going to want to look at this phone, or even any phone in this price range for that matter. But if you're really just looking for a phone to use as a phone and not really a whole lot else, then I do think for what it is, even at this point in 2023, the Motorola Moto G Pure is at least worth considering. Now once again, if you do want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.